It was just such a small little thing, but said so much, like a beautiful idea.
See you, fellas. See you, man.
It's just the old... No, I'm not pulling the beer away from my lips to say goodbye. It's just the old-fashioned... Yeah, it's magnificent.
Then he came back to New Zealand, enjoyed enormous success for 4 or 5 years as Fred Dagg. And Fred Dagg became a sort of monster, I think.
Now, obviously, the first thing to decide is what sort of novelist you'd like to be. A tall novelist, a short novelist, or, in fact, a novelist of medium stature. Perhaps a modern novelist, a neoclassicist, or a pastoral stream of consciousness Gothic feminist. Now, next... you're halfway there when you've done that, incidentally. Next, you've got to sit down and pound out your actual novel, beginning each new sentence with a capital, of course, and remembering to number the pages very carefully indeed. There's nothing more frustrating to the reader than getting right through a novel and discovering that it was read in completely the wrong order.
He was as big in New Zealand as the young Paul Hogan was in Australia.
So famous, so painfully famous, that I think it all but consumed him.
He was as big as the Beatles, kind of. It seemed like that. There was sort of a... And I think it would have been pretty tough for him, in that he wouldn't have been able to leave the house without people mistaking him for Fred Dagg. And it became necessary for John to leave New Zealand and leave Fred behind. Australia kind of liberated him. Yeah, it was a liberation.
I did mostly radio when I first got here because I didn't feel I could come here and just walk in and go, well, I'll just, you know, hang my shingle up and away we go. Because I'd never lived here for a long time. I didn't know the sub-language. I didn't understand the football. I didn't know the place names. It wasn't my history. So I needed to lie low for a while and learn.
He actually just observed Australia.
Right.
For a few years, just to kind of get an angle on the nuances and the culture, instead of just jumping right in going, well, I was big there, so I could instantly be big here.
I hired John and Andrew Knight to work at a little film company called Adams Packer. We all knew that he was a raving genius.
Then we went on and we shared an office for, I don't know, about 4 years, and we did a series together, 2 series together. For the ABC.
Listen, we just had some members of the police force pay us a social call.
Ah. My name come up?
Afraid so. If you were planning a little holiday, it might be an idea to bring the date forward a bit.
How'd they find out?
Buggered if I know.
Oh, well, I thought things were going a bit well.
The first thing that happens with John when you work in a room with him is virtually nothing. We would go into the office every day, we would sit down, we'd make a cup of tea, and we would sit and we would talk for sometimes 4 hours straight without having written a word. And then we would usually go for a swim and we'd say, we've really got to get back to work. And then John would usually go off and talk to someone like the pool attendant for another hour. And then he would come back and we'd go, well, we're hungry, we better go and eat. And then we would eat and we would talk for another hour about nothing.
I don't know how the process worked. All I know is that his wife, Helen, still has one of her favourite photographs, she says, and that is of John and I sitting at their kitchen table up in the hills. And every time she would walk past, she would say, how are you going? And we would always say, just putting on the finishing touches.
I would say, but John, we haven't written anything. And then he'd go, oh, okay, all right. And in an hour, the last hour of the day, half an hour of the day, we would actually do the work. But what was extraordinary about John was that everything that had happened that day, everything we'd talked about, in his head he'd shaped it. And it just went straight down on paper.
I'm sure everyone will say, John loved a long chat.
John, did you hear about the Bolivian soccer team?
Morning, Gina. No, I've spent most of the morning in the company of Michael Schumacher's considerably less talented brother Trevor Schumacher, who's had the shock absorbers taken out of his taxi, Gina, and he's picking a few bob up driving the wrong way up one-way streets all over Sydney at the speed of sound. Tell me about the Bolivian soccer team.
Everywhere Dad went, he chatted. He used to leave the house and say he was going down to the office. He had lots of very important things to do and he couldn't possibly come with us to do whatever it was that we were off to do. And we'd call the office in 10 minutes. Took him 10 minutes to get to the office. wasn't there. Call him back half an hour later, not there. Call him back an hour later, he still hadn't arrived. But he'd had some great chats in the street between the house and the office.
There was a lot of Annie Maver, our first assistant director. There was a lot of him talking and her sort of dragging him as he's talking with the sort of Kleenexes in. Somebody's taking those out and powderings, and he's just still chatting.
You get John on the phone, that's it. Just you can sign your, that's an hour.
My wife would say, if it's John, don't answer it. And of course, you have to answer to John because it's the most entertaining hour of your life.
Now, another very important aspect of our work is phone tapping, because all sorts of communistic nonsense gets spoken over telephone. So we tap the phones like this with a special tapper that we're provided with by the Brigadier, and no communistic conversation can sneak through here anymore.
And as a very dear friend of his said from New Zealand to me on the phone the other day, John won't be in heaven yet. And I said, why is that? And he said, he'll still be at the gate talking to the gatekeeper. And that's how John was. He would talk to anyone.
It filled your life with fun and made you think as well.
That's right. And I guess the first time as a teenager when I got into comedy was watching the Gillies Report.
I want you to be in charge of programming.
Are you having a borrow of me, Arthur?
Never more serious, Terry. Never more Lambeth in my ear hole.
What do I know about television programmes?
The Gillies Report was and remains the apotheosis of Australian satire. John was a contributing writer who then became a somewhat reluctant participant.
What genuine need is there for foreign banks when we've had a very wide range of Australian banks here for almost 100 years?
Well, yes. I'm bound to say that I agree with what's already been said about improvement in customer services. I think that's perfectly obvious. I think that's going to manifest itself relatively early. I think that if you're asking what's going to happen to the Australian domestic economy in a macroeconomic sense, then...
He had told me, and I hadn't paid enough attention, I think, to the fact that the reason he left New Zealand was he wanted to get away from the oppression that he'd felt as a performer. But then once he started to join us, the ideas just kept coming. He did a series of politicians as phantasmagorical birds.
Would it be true to say that you own most of the world?
No, only the free world.
Most of the free world?
Yes, that would be true.
How did you do that?
I bought it.
Is there any corruption in New South Wales?
No, not whatsoever. No corruption in New South Wales, no.
Well, come on, surely there's always been corruption in New South Wales in the 60s and the 50s.
There has been in the past, yes, but we've researched it, we've looked into it, and those people have given it away.
But then on top of that, there was farnarkling.
Farnarkling history was made last night in Madrid when Australia confounded the experts and bundled Scotland out of an incident-packed semi-final in front of an estimated crowd. Once again, the very dexterous Dave Sorensen dominated the attacking phase and after a short time was arkling from all points of the compass. Unfortunately, he suffered a spectacular mishap in the middle of the fourth warble when he dislodged a pinion in the goalpost housing and impaled himself on the southern wall.
And all these wonderful ideas for production numbers that we did as semi-musicals.
Order, by order of the Governor-General, this Parliament has ceased to be. It is no more, it has gone to meet its maker, it is an ex-Parliament, it is completely bugled, the taxidermist is on his way. Sit down!
In the end, he became central to the show. We couldn't have done it without him.
Shut up! Sit, I give up.
I got the job as head of radio comedy and unit, that's right, and I was the unit. There was just me. And so the first thing I thought of, who am I going to get? And of course, John Clark is the obvious person.
John rang me one night and said, I think I've worked out how to make a living for the next 10 years. And I said, oh yeah, what's that?
Mr. Howard, thank you for your time. You're a very busy man.
Oh, it's cool.
My friends aren't going to believe this.
Oh, you're very kind.
Do you get a lot of fan mail?
Yeah, tons of it. I don't reply to it all, but, I'd like to, but it's not possible.
Dad was delighted with Brian's warm, lovely voice and what he described as a preternatural understanding of natural speech rhythms.
So I thought, wow, this is all right. So I sent this around to all the different ABC stations, and the audience, God bless them, as they always did, grabbed hold of it and loved it, and it was a year later we ended up going to Channel 9.
Mr Kennett, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me in. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Mr Kennett, would it be fair to say that all you've got to do to become Premier of Victoria is to keep your nose clean and not alienate the electorate?
Why don't you shut up, you stupid fat idiot?
We didn't dress up and we didn't do voices, and that was a product of having done it on radio for a year. It just seemed silly to go and do it any other way.
Mr Bond, how have you been?
Oh, pretty good, thanks. Yeah, fine.
How are things going?
Oh, a bunch of fluffy ducks.
The acceptance of what we were doing on Channel 9 came very quickly, and that's because we had Yarn Events in Parramatta, and she sold it for us.
Do you pay tax as a matter of interest?
I do.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I admire the poor. I admire them enormously. My God, you're an admirable group.
Mr Bond, thank you for your time.
Well, thank you.
Oh, John Clark using one of his many aliases. That's it for tonight and this week. Have a great weekend. Good night.
I remember one skit he did he played Bob Hawke and he played me, and it was about the time I replaced Bob as Prime Minister, and so it's a contest from our particular points of view, you know. But he had it pretty right.
Well, look, you know, Bob came to me at one stage and said he was thinking of getting out, you know, giving me a go. I mean, you know, and I said, you know, thanks, Bob. Well, no. Paul's recollection is simply not accurate.
It is delicious. He's more Keating than Paul, he's more Hawke than Bob.
Well, I don't think there's any doubt in anybody's mind that Paul was a very able fellow. It was just that he didn't have the maturity and breadth of vision that was going to be required in Australia at that time.
I remember a night, he and I went to the opening night of Keating the Musical, and there was an after party, and we went to the after party and Keating himself was there. And he came over, and John was very keen to have Keating to himself, so he just sort of put an arm up against the wall there.
These guys pick up stuff from you, and of course there's nothing like a conversation to pick up things, you know, mannerisms, hand movements, eye movements, you know what I mean? And he would soak this stuff in, he'd store it up. I used to say, you know, so he'd say, you know, he'd have the you-knows in there.
Well, it was in this room where I'm talking to you now, and I came in, you know, and I said, Bob, you know, I hear you're thinking of staying on, and Bob said that, yeah, he was, and I'd said that, you know, you know, that's not what I understood to be the terms of our agreement, and, you know, I thought you were going to go, and, you know, I've been pushing things through the Premier's conference. I mean, there's an awful lot of work there, and I thought, you know, where's the mileage in this for me if I'm not allowed to run the country?
So when Yarn Event left Channel 9, the people there didn't think it was appropriate that our humour continued, and so we got the boot, and that's how we ended up in the ABC, and which is where we should have been in the first place, but there you go.
I was given the dubious job, among other producers, of producing a Clark Door segment.
Mr. Howard, thanks for your time.
What's the one, other than global warming, what was the other thing you mentioned you want to cover?
Climate change.
Climate change.
Climate change.
Climate change.
And it's urgent we do something about this.
Urgent. It's urgent.
You know, there is an irony that in a cutthroat world of current affairs where it's fast-paced and you're constantly moving on, John would just walk in and he'd slow us down and he'd give us a sense of perspective and he'd make us laugh at the issue and the situation, but often at ourselves as well, which was humbling.
Cyclone Malcolm,
yes.
Is that formed yet? Or is
not fully. A number of low-pressure systems are moving there, and it's way south of where we thought it would be. It's a long way south.
Should people be worried about Malcolm?
Well, people should always be worried by a cyclone. There's enormous energy there, even if it doesn't seem to know what it's doing. Can I talk about Bill Shorten on national television?
Yeah, you can.
By
According to this contract, yes, you can.
Right, good. I'll need a bucket, a plunger, some Drano, a hose and a mask. And keep those kids in the car.
Now, you're with the Norwegian government, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. What's your position there?
I'm just near the window.
Mr Costello, are you happy with the new cabinet?
Yes, indeed. Very good cabinet. Some very good people in there.
Some exciting, fresh new ideas?
You still talking about the cabinet?
He was a word man. He loves words. He loves words and wordsmithing, and wordsmithing is dying now.
Looking back on John's work, it's so broad, you know, there was almost nothing he couldn't